Hello, and thank you for checking out my video on standardized assessments. My name is Melissa Nedved, and we will be looking at the role that standardized assessments play in my high school math classroom. So the high-stakes standardized assessment that my Branson School Online, Colorado-based online school uses is the PARC, the assessment. And that's not what I'm going to focus on in this presentation for a number of reasons. The first is that our PARC assessment is really too new for improvement data. My school implemented it for the first time last year, and in fact, we didn't even get our results from that until almost winter break this year. So we're not able to show student growth with just 1 year of testing, and we can't see really how our students are doing because it's just too new. Another problem with looking at the PARC data as my standardized assessment to drive my instruction is that the way that we were allowed to view was very restricted to review the results, in that one of my classes had just too few students in it to even generate a report. So I was looking at pulling my reports and I was needing to use them in my teacher evaluation, and there just literally is not enough data there for me to pull a report from. The thing that I do like about the PARC assessment is that there's both selective response and creative responses for the testing questions. So I think it's a better assessment that way compared to what I am going to pull from for this presentation. Again, just not enough data for it. And the last reason I didn't choose to look at the PARC results was that the way they broke down the questions based on standards was very difficult to follow. We had talked with our assessment coordinator. She'd said, oh, this is an area of need, but we didn't even really know what that title meant. And she was in the works of finding kind of a better breakdown of the way that they sub-tested the categories. And so just overall, it was not a good test to pull from when looking at standardized assessments. So instead, I've chosen to focus this presentation on the NWE math test that my school administers. It's the Northwest Evaluation Association is what NWEA stands for, and the MAP means it's a measure of academic progress. Now, what I really like about this math test is that it's a computer adaptive test, meaning kids are going to get different questions based on how they answer the previous question. So not all 9th grade math tests are going to look the same. It's going to be based on how well they're doing. If they're scoring incorrectly, then they're going to go to easier question types. If they're scoring correctly, they're going to go to harder question types. And that gives them a much better readout of where they're at in each of those standards. At our school, we do administer this test 3 times a year, in the fall, in the winter, and in the spring. So we're able to get a lot of growth data from that. Our students test in math, English, and science, and we test all the way from elementary up through 12th graders. All grades actually test. The problem with this test, one of the big problems on just an entry level, is that it is a test that students take at home. So it's not monitored by teachers or proctors of any kind. So it can be unreliable in that it's possible that parents help students answer the questions, or it's possible that students rush through, just click their answers, and we can look at things like how long they spend on the test and if their data is consistent and that kind of thing. But it is a little bit less reliable in that respect, as opposed to the PARC test, which students come to a proctor setup testing site. But overall, I think the advantages of the NWE test give me a much better set of results to focus on to drive my instruction in the classroom as far as a standardized assessment than the PARC data does. So the flow chart that I've included here to discuss the purpose of the standardized testing and what it measures as far as student achievement is very basic. However, my subsequent slides will really break down what I mean from each of these. So I think it does 3 major things. Our NWA testing data allows for data-driven instruction to a very specific level, and I'm going to show you a little bit more about that in my next slide. But that's one of my favorite things about the way the NWEA testing data is delivered to us. I also think it's a valid measurement of growth. Not only do we administer it 3 times a year, but we administer it every year. So students who have been with us for 4 or 5 years have a lot of data to review how they have grown from year to year, subject to subject within that year, things that they're improving on and things that they need improvement on, maybe areas that they didn't grow. I see that a lot when I'm looking at my homeroom students who might not necessarily be in one of my math classes, but typically juniors and seniors tend to decrease their score in their geometry classes because they hit it early on in their high school career and they don't touch geometry again. So it gives us a lot of valuable ways to measure how these students are doing. And lastly, I think that it does a great job with norm-based scores, so students can compare where they're at compared to the large norm, the testing data, as well as just their school themselves. And we'll look at that a little bit later, but I think, again, just it does a lot of really good in reliable ways to measure this data. So as I mentioned, the data-driven instruction, or what we call data to instruction framework, this is an example of one that I did for my class a couple weeks ago in my consumer math class. And using the way that NWA gives us our data, using what we call the RIT breakdown, I was able to structure an entire unit on probability into 3 groups. And we called I selected the groups of being below the RIT range, the middle score, at the normal RIT range, and then above the RIT range. And so what's covered up there in orange is I went through and I labeled where each student fell within the RIT range category, and then picked out one of the skills within the subcategory of data analysis, statistics, and probability that I wanted to work on. And I met with each of those groups individually. I grouped them within their student groups into smaller groups where they created projects. Each project was different based on their assessment, how I scored them, how we went over them. So I was able to really individualize the instruction for this unit on probability based on their RIT scores from the NWEA test. So it was a great way to drive my instruction. The NWEA is an achievement test that is Common Core aligned. When we're given results, their scores are broken down by standards, so that we can see exactly where students are scoring well, where they maybe need some improvement based on how they've scored in the past and based on how other students are scoring. So we have a lot of information there. Which also comes into play with the class breakdown by RIT score. So what we just looked at was a small portion of how you can use that class breakdown by RIT score to drive your instruction. And it's a test that is able to test at a student's level as opposed to their grade level. So as we talked about with the computer-based achievement, is that it's not just the same test for each student. It's really differentiated by where that student is in each of those topics. So here's just a little screenshot. Now, the math test is broken down into 7 different categories, and each category has a lot of subcategories. And when you look at one of the breakdown options, here I've taken, and I said, hey, I want to look at where my kids in a certain class fall for number sense properties and operations, and within that category, the subcategory of real and complex numbers. Now, this page itself, when it loads, is a very long page. I just took a snapshot of the very lowest RIT range, which would be 191 to 200. And notice on the right, I picked that one because there were no students there, so I didn't have to worry about covering up student names. But it breaks down each of those skills that within that subcategory the students hit if they fall within that RIT range. And there's, depending on the subcategory, is going to depend on what the breakdown is, but you're able to really review where students fall, not just on a large scale, but on a small scale, for each individual topic. So the way I grouped students for my probability project could be very different from the way I grouped them if I was looking at real and complex numbers. And so one of the great things about this achievement assessment is that it does allow me to really get a good readout of the students' breakdowns. As mentioned before, this is a norm-based interpretive framework, but it not only gives you it by grade level, so it would say this is where you fall within the norm-based group of grade level, but also by the district itself. So we can compare students, where our students fall, who are at the top of the students in our school, and the middle and the bottom. Another really nice thing about the way NWEA does their scoring data for us is that when we pull student scores and send them to them, lots of times it will include a RIT projection, meaning this is where the student should fall, or based on how they've done in the past, this is about where they should be the next time they test. It does also include a percentile ranking and growth over testing period. So this is just taken from a sample student that NWEA had posted, but it shows here one way of giving a student the data. Now, there's a lot of different worksheets that they include for student data, but this is just one example. And you can see here, it's a line graph including 3 different lines. The first there in blue is the actual students' RIT values, or their actual students' scores. And so you can see where they started in fall, they rose to winter, they fell a little bit in spring, and then again in summer. Now the dotted line is where their projected RIT should be. So they're saying over the next year, this is about where we'd like you to fall. Now if you look at the orange, that's showing where that student, or that's showing the district average RIT scores. So you can see that in blue, the blue is above the orange in fall and winter, then the blue falls below the orange in spring and summer. So that student could see how he compares to the other students in his class. And then lastly, that score there in yellow, the line graph in yellow, talks about the norms for the grade level. So based on all the students taking this exam, and again, allows that student to kind of compare. He does fall below that in each category, so it would be something for him to know. Now you can also see that they have the values over the course of many years on the right in the table. Again, same type of thing, showing the RIT scores, whether they fell or grew, where they should be in comparison in the future, and then the percentile range. That is something that they include here on the far right-hand side that was not included in the line graph. So a lot of ways of presenting their score. So it's not just one score given to the students and they're expected to know what that means. They're seeing it in a lot of ways. Now, the tool that I use the most with my homeroom students, meaning the students I have, not just in my math classes, but I have them and I follow with them throughout their high school careers, what they give us to provide feedback to the students, called the NWEA goal setting worksheet. And here's just a small snapshot of what part of that worksheet looks like. But it takes the student scores, and this was pulled from after they took the winter test, and it compares their fall score to their winter score, and that's what you see in the blue bar graph. And then to the right of that, it breaks it down by the categories. Anything highlighted in green is an area of growth. Anything in yellow is an area of potential concern. It shows you where those RIT scores fell. It gives it just a broad category instead of the specific score. And then it also included what they put in as a projected RIT growth. So you can see for this student from fall to winter in mathematics, his fall score was 242. They projected that he should rise about 2 values to 244. In fact, he increased that to 251. Now for his reading score, he had a 229 in the fall. They projected a RIT growth of 231, and he rose to 230. So he didn't quite meet that projected growth. But again, it's a really good breakdown of these scores for the students. And it does this for all of the tests that they take, and then I go over it with them and their parents so I can provide a really thorough feedback for them. And then they are also able to write an action plan or give themselves a goal. So like I said, for math, a lot of the time students have a decrease in their geometry score as they get to their junior and senior years. So they might have a goal of spending a little bit more time focusing on geometry. There might be something they bring back to their math class to ask to review, and those types of things. So I think it is a great tool to offer feedback for students on their scores. The one biggest downfall that I see with the NWEA testing is that it only has selective response question types. It does have a little bit of variability with them, where some questions are just one correct answer and other selective responses have multiple correct answers, so it's a little bit beyond just your typical multiple choice, but it's very restrictive in that question type. Now, the upside to having just selective responsive question types is it's completely objective and it allows for quick feedback. In fact, we get test results within 24 hours of a student completing their NWEA test, which is great. I really appreciate that. However, with this big shift to Common Core, one of the big points is that we're not just taking selective response questions. We're requiring or we're asking students to think beyond that. And unfortunately, at this time, the NWEA testing does not do that. So I would not consider them Common Core level questions, and hence the reason we still do the PARCC testing, and that will, I'm sure, eventually start to fade out this type of testing itself, but in the meantime, it's a good source for us. So just a couple examples of the types of questions that NWEA has. This would be an example of a selective response with just one correct answer. How many girls voted for volleyball then? How many more girls voted for volleyball than softball as their favorite sport? There's just one right answer, and they're giving you 4 choices. So if you guessed, you still have a 25% chance of getting it right. And this is what I was talking about, though. Sometimes there are multiple right answers. So here they're asked to click on all of the cylinders. So there are 6 3D shapes shown here, and you could click one, you could click all 6, you could click any in between. So there's a lot less probability of a student getting this right by simply guessing. So it does take it a little bit more to that level beyond just strictly multiple choice, but still not necessarily the best question type. So despite the restrictions in question types, I do think the NWEA testing for our students is great in that it gives such detailed feedback, not just to the students, but to us as teachers, and then it allows me to really drive my instruction to meet that. I'm hoping in the future we can get a better result from our PARCC testing to use that more, since it does have more of the Common Core aligned type of questions. But in the meantime, I think this is a great middle ground. Thanks for watching.